Welcome to Birdsong with your host, Kayuta Kiora, exploring all things related to the path of shamanism, nature-based spirituality, truth-seeking, storytelling, awakening, health and wellness, earth-honoring traditions, ceremony, ritual, rites of passage, and of course, a remembering of the sacred ways. Hey, it's Caillou here. Thanks for joining me on Birdsong. In this episode, we have Asher Packman joining us. Now, Asher is a certified HeartMath and Wim Hof method instructor. He's a Kundalini Yoga teacher. He's the current president of Meditation Australia. He's the founder of The Fifth Direction and The Warrior Within, including the Warrior Within podcast, alongside being associated with many other interesting and remarkable facets of life. Now, over the past decade, Asher has grown to become a globally recognized mindset coach and meditation teacher. And what I love about Asher, aside from being a kind and generous and lovely human being and friend, is that he combines neuroscience and epigenetics with Eastern philosophies and shamanism and mythology, which offers a well-rounded approach that helps people connect to the unlimited potential of their own true nature, and also which offers a greater depth of experience within our own lives. So some of the things that we touched on in this particular conversation include honoring the sacred, the importance of storytelling and mythology, descending into the darkness to come to know ourselves on a deep heart and soul level. We explore some of the ins and outs when it comes to rites of passage. Asher shares some of his own personal experiences that touch on death, dying, health, psych wards, some insights into his own personal journey and relationship with a rare type of cancer. We talk about heart-based consciousness, shamanism, conspiracy theories, and many other threads of that nature. So it was a real pleasure to welcome Asher to Birdsong, and I trust you'll find some gemstones in our dialogue to carry with you on your own path forward. Firstly, Asher, just want to welcome you, my friend, to Birdsong and give a big warm welcome and a thanks for carving out this little space, within your day, within your morning to come and join the show. It's very much appreciated.
Oh, thanks, brother. I mean, likewise, I appreciate the opportunity to join you in conversation. I feel like every time we chat, it's really a beautiful experience for me, and I always walk away learning something I didn't know before. So it's kind of a gift to be invited to Birdsong. So thank you.
That's a very lovely thing to say. So to open up this portal, this little conversation that we're about to have, I'd love to preface it with the following framework before inviting you to share a few words of your own. And this framework revolves around the opening and closing of a ceremonial container. So typically when we're engaging in ceremonial or ritualistic practices, when we do open or close our container, generally, in one way or another, we're sharing words or intentions that are being spoken or thought or felt to signify that we're dropping into a special moment in time, a sacred moment in time. And this opening and closing typically revolves around honoring the sacred in one way, shape, or form. And in light of what this show is revolved around, I'd love to ask if you'd be willing to share something to open up our space in relation to how you might typically open up your own ceremonial or ritualistic practices. And I guess the second part of that, in conjunction to your words, perhaps then we can flow into some dialogue around your musings surrounding the importance in the way that you personally choose to approach such things of this nature and the way that you choose to honor the sacred. So I'd love to offer you the floor, brother.
Wow, that's one hell of an intro. I love it. Thank you, man. Perfect. Let me just feel into that for a moment. Yeah, let's close down our eyes. Shall we both close down our eyes?
Sure.
And for me, it's generally about beginning with the breath Just coming back to your breathing and finding your footprint of breath, your natural cadence without any force. And just observing the body. Connecting back into the flow of nature. And as we do that, I'd like to call in the 4 sacred directions. And just feeling the spirit keepers and the winds from each of those directions joining us in this conversation. And calling in the great serpent from the south in the way of truth, connection to the earth. And calling in the owl from the west, the magician, the secret skills we all have, the creativity that resides within each of us. And from the north, the warrior spirit, the wolf, or in our indigenous culture, the dingo. And from the east, the eagle and the condor, representing life and death, transformation. Just feeling into the center together, brother, the king energy. Just feeling everything come together and land. Our connection to the earth, calling in the divine feminine. And above, the great father, the masculine. And feeling that land within us as the two of us come together as men, as brothers. And finally, brother, I just invite you to place your hand over your chest. And just giving gratitude. The conditions have come together that enable us to have this conversation, to share these words, to learn from one another. And in the hope, in the desire that those listening can gain something and add, of course, their energy to this gathering. And with that, this sacred container, this circle is open. Aho.
Aho, brother. Thank you for such a sincere and evocative opening, brother. Some interesting threads to explore there. And I think some of these threads, they actually form some of the pillars that we might find in many ceremonial and ritualistic and sacred practices on a global level. And the way that you brought us both into breath in the beginning speaks to the importance of presence. Man, presence is it is the foundation for everything that we do in life, cultivating that sense of presence. And how deeply present can we be to ourselves, to others, to everything that's happening around us, everything that's happening within our lives. One of the key pillars that I'm constantly trying to cultivate on deeper and deeper levels, and to bring more awareness to where I have a lack of presence in my life. And I think the container of being at home, during this strange collective time we find ourselves in is a potent magnifying glass for the areas within home life and family life and just life in general where I can deepen into that presence. But getting into some of the other things that you touched on were calling in these archetypal energies. And this is something that I would love to explore with you on a greater level. Not just these archetypal energies, but kind of the way that these weave in with story and myth and how these inform us on a greater level, on maybe a deeper psychological or a deeper spiritual level. And many moons ago, you were kind enough to invite me to join one of your men's circles to contribute some offerings around shamanism, plant medicine, altered states of consciousness. And what I noticed back then, and what I continue to notice through continued online dialogue, is that mythology and storytelling and archetypes, alongside philosophy and psychology, from people like Carl Jung, Joseph Campbell, Robert Bly, your Martin Shaws, and of course many others, they seem to inform and underpin a lot of the meditations and conversations that you have been involved in and that you continue to offer. So what I'm getting at and where I'm leading us here is, what is it about stories and what is it about mythologies? Like, what do you see as the importance within these threads, in particular when it comes to men's work? And why do so many of your meditations and dialogues find root in this landscape?
It's a beautiful question, brother, and there's kind of a personal answer to that, in that I've found that story and myth has kind of lit me up and spoken to a very deep kind of ancient place in me for as long as I can remember, maybe all the way back to when I was a little boy. I was always fascinated by storytelling and story and that kind of imagination. But for men, I think it's kind of a lost art. I mean, the ancient way we used to, the ancient rites of passage was all about the transmission of these stories, you know, the indigenous songlines, for example. And I feel like maybe, I guess Robert Bly would say, since the industrial age, we've kind of lost that piece of us. And for me, stories and myth penetrate the heart, and they bring up our own kind of soul story, if you will. And so for a lot of men that I find in this modern day, when we sit in circle, we've got to get in behind the armor somehow. And I believe that myth and story is the way in, because if you take Joseph Campbell's point of view, for example, it's all one story, you know, the hero's journey, the monomyth. And so if we can tell a story, men will find themselves landing in that story wherever they need to land. You know, it's speaking to the deeper psyche, to the subconscious, and men will get out of it exactly what they need to. Whether they resonate with a particular character or a particular part of the story, it's like, yeah, that's me right now, and then there's a thread from that point that they can grab a hold of, and it will help bring them back to the center. And so it's not about everybody getting the same thing about it. It's completely different. And you also don't have to kind of sit there and try to understand the whole story. It's almost kind of letting it flow. It's almost beyond time, beyond space. Robert Bly has a beautiful thing. He says, don't worry about writing everything down if you feel you've missed something, because the man next to you will have done that. It's a collective experience. So I think that partly answers it.
So what I want to touch on there is, for someone that may be tuning in and who doesn't necessarily have a strong reference point to what it is that we're talking about, how might you articulate on a more, I'm not sure whether simplistic or basic is the right language that I'm going for here, but how might you try and navigate the way that you language this for someone that doesn't necessarily know what kind of stories that we're actually talking about, because there are so many different stories. There's the stories in nursery rhymes, there's children's stories, there's the stories that thread themselves through Hollywood blockbuster movies, then there's the stories from old, the myths that we're touching on here. So how might you articulate that to someone?
Yeah, and you're right there. Yeah, all the way from yes, like a fairy tale through to like a Zen koan, and kind of what's the link, I guess, is the question. Because in a sense, all these things are pretty much the same. But there's a reason why. Like, I think, like, the way we opened that circle, it's the kind of thing you need to soften into before you tell a myth. I think you need to take someone out of ordinary reality. Like, from a shamanistic point of view, you're taking someone out of ordinary reality and placing them in non-ordinary reality. So we're basically making that bridge between your conscious mind and your subconscious mind, and allowing a dialogue to flow between the two. And so if you can kind of float in a story and move out of your everyday existence, things in your subconscious will begin to bubble up, and you'll start to perhaps make sense of what seemed unsolvable problems in your everyday life. You start to look at them through a different lens. So yeah. Is that somewhere along the road to an answer?
Yeah, I think it is. What I particularly resonate, or what I find, let me rephrase that. Martin Shaw, I've been listening to a lot of Martin Shaw lately, and one of the things that he speaks of is within these old stories and within these old myths, they're not speaking to fact, but they're trying to find a way to point to truths of some sort. And I feel that within these stories, they're not necessarily stories that are full of the love and the light that are typically talked of in the spiritual communities, within the New Age spiritual communities that many of us find ourselves in, all about the ascension. But rather, these stories are largely focused on the descent into the challenge and the pain and the suffering. And as Martin Shaw would say, that's where the grit is. That's where we find the nutrients that really soak into the marrow of our bones, that really give us the nourishment to be able to not just grow, but find more depth into who we are as people, depth into the heart, depth into the soul. So I feel like there's a real importance of descending into the underworld to face the rotten tooth and claw of monsters long rejected.
Oh man, I love what you just said there, because for me, it's all about the art of the descent. I think, as we are as a society now, we're taught that the way to happiness is up, 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 up. And if you think about it, the economy, everything, it's all about the ascension, and the way that the model of success is built on, the corporate ladder, up, 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 up. And we're missing probably the greatest piece, in that our learning all comes from the going down. And these myths, they're all about, time spent under the earth a lot of the time, and that's where our hero will, find his true purpose, or his calling, or his soul story. It's a little bit we had a brief conversation, you and I, around names and naming conventions, at the beginning. And there's a lovely old idea that maybe your whole life is around finding out your true name. And the fact that the stars already know what your name is. It's etched on your soul. And if we go up and ascend, we're actually moving away from finding out who we really are, because that name, it's down in the under the earth, in the ground, and we need to sort of dig away at the dirt and reveal it. The soul, the stars up there, the ascension, it already knows your name. But for you to find it, you got to go the other way. And so for me, I obviously changed my name as well. And part of that was as a result of just, maybe not completely, but beginning to understand who I really was. Maybe I swept away a little bit of dirt from underneath, and part of that name was somehow reflected back at me, and I caught a bit of it, But I just don't believe you're going to find it by up, up, up all the time.
Yeah, when you're talking about these...
You also need...
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, by going down, we also build deep roots. And if we ascend all the time, and we're, shallow in terms of our connection underneath the earth, we're just going to blow over. So the idea is to go down, build these deep roots, and then ascend. I was actually listening to Michael Mead talk about this just a couple of days ago, and he was saying there's basically three levels of existence, and we have level one, which is kind of what he would call kind of assumed normalcy, which is above the earth and the sort of conditioned world, if you want, the kind of world where if I say to someone down the street, how are you doing? You say, I'm fine, without even thinking about it. It's just this remote control conditioned space that we live in, which is more about, and then from that place, we try to ascend. And he was saying the second level is the under the earth. It's the grief and the sorrow, which we desperately try to avoid because we think it's somehow bad or somehow equates to unhappiness. And then there's the third level, which he believes is, the beautiful, we're all connected world of spirituality, but in its true sense, And he was he made a beautiful point. He said the thing that people aren't seeing is when you're at the second level, you're closer to the third level.
Right.
Than you are at the first level.
Right.
So rather than sinking into that and seeing it as depression and anxiety and a hole that you need to climb out of, he's like, just keep going, because you're closer to where the ultimate destination is, where you will find your true name and you'll find all these beautiful things will be revealed to you and you'll understand who you really are.
Yeah, I love that. And the way that you're languaging yourself, you're bringing up these images within myself when you're talking about the dirt and the soil and the stars and ascending into the sky. And this ties into some of the way that I language the type of work that we're doing when we're descending. And a lot of people might ask the question, why would we want to go into our pain? Why would we want to go into our suffering? Why do we want to go outside of our comfort zone? And we do see this. It's a bit of a thread that runs quite deep through a lot of society and culture, people staying in the bubble of their comfort zone and not wanting to extend past that. But, the way that I language it is that we're born into life and we naturally inherit these weeds in our garden. There's a fog of conditioning, the atmospheric fog of conditioning, societal conditioning, cultural conditioning, and, also the crust of our ancestors as well. And if we want the greater roots, within ourselves, the greater roots of perhaps purpose or truth to take hold, we got to pull the weeds from our garden and we got to nurture our soil. And if we want the molten core of our tender heart's longing, whatever that is, to expose itself, man, we've got to deal with the outer crust. And if we do want to behold the North Star, perhaps that is calling our true name, our true essence, we've got to clear away the atmospheric fog of conditioning so that we can actually see these things. And that is why there's such an importance of getting down into the muck and into the dirt and the debris and working with that stuff, digging our hands in and feeling around and seeing what's there so we can start to clear everything. We need to almost shine a flashlight on the limiting beliefs and the emotional baggage and all the unhealthy behaviors, so we're not walking around every corner and stubbing our toe on everything because we're carrying around these things that are ultimately weighing us down. So that's one of the ways that I tend to language this, and I think perhaps that's maybe what the stories and the myths are trying to point to in some sense as well, these truths about ourselves deep down, so that we can start to clear these out and get more of a sense of the truth of who we are on a heart and soul level.
Yeah, man. Yes, simply yes. And I think that most of us, we it's like we want to take a pill to get well. We don't actually want to actually have a flu and a fever and do all the things that the body actually needs to create wellness. And there's many examples of this. I mean, as you know, I do this stuff with the Wim Hof method with the ice bath, for example. Everybody wants the benefits of having a stronger immune system, but unfortunately, you've got to sit in a bucket of ice to get there. And there's literally no other way. And taking it back to those kind of three levels of existence that Michael Mead talks about, there's no way to get from level 1 to level 3 without going directly through level 2. And I think most of our suffering in this world comes from being in level 1 wanting level 3, but not being willing to go through level 2 to get there. And so we just sit in level 1 and suffer that we can't have level 3, which in fact is a greater suffering than the ordeal of going through level 2.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense.
And most of us, the thing is, we're going to end up in level 2 anyway, because you're going to lose your job, you're going to have a health issue, someone's going to die, something's going to happen, which is going to thrust you into level 2 anyway. And it's like, for me, the work that we're doing is actually providing you with the map or the tools or the navigational expertise to deal with level 2 when you get there and actually control your descent as opposed to being thrust into it.
Yeah, this is starting to touch on initiations and
completely.
rites of passage. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, that's what a rite of passage is, isn't it? If you look at our indigenous cultures, it's taking, let's say, boys to men, it's taking them and placing them in the hard stuff, but actually as elders giving them the map, and so that they have to face their own death, face their own fears in a way which is cultured and historically relevant to the way that culture may live, and you're given the tools, but you're taken to the edge still. Yeah, and we don't have that, and so we see a lot of anxiety and depression in our society, largely because people are pushed off the cliff with nothing and told that being there is bad.
Yeah, you and I both know, and I'm sure many of the listeners will know of the homogenous state of society and culture, in the sense that we don't have these rites of passage to push us into manhood or to lead us into womanhood. And we could probably speak to some of the rites of passage in a sense that we do have, whatever that may be, whether it's turning 18 or 21 or having your first drink or the first time you have sex or you get a job, you have a car, you go to uni, all these kind of things that have kind of act as somewhat of a very much diluted, I don't even know if it's a diluted form of a rite of passage, because they're so fundamentally different at its core. And I guess what I'm getting at is I would love for you to touch on perhaps the difference in, the rites of passage that we are speaking to, that do lead to the depth and the expansion of oneself on a heart and soul level, versus the rites of passage that are finding themselves to be more of a societal or cultural norm in that kind of homogenous, watered down state.
Yeah, obviously I do a lot of work with men, and I see that piece is, almost completely missing from most men's life. And also where I'd start perhaps there is a lot of people tend to, any rites of passage or any wisdom that's coming down is often coming down from dad, from your father. And I think, you and I both know that generally speaking, it's not the father that gives, that is not the initiator. It's almost exclusively has to not be the father. It has to come from another man. Like your father and your mentor or your guide need to be two different beings. The father is there for one particular set of experiences, but the initiatory rites need to come from another group or certainly another man. And I'm just not seeing that at all. And so that's why sitting in brotherhood and doing all this work, and I'm particularly gratified when I see young men coming to join our circle, because me, in my own life, if I was 21 or 22, there'd be no way that I'd spend a Tuesday or a Wednesday evening going to sit down with a group of, older men from all walks of life. And so for me, I think something's changing, and that I can look around the circle now and see these younger guys who've, something's awakened in them that they need to be there, and then they say to me, rather than being down the pub, getting drunk, chasing women or whatever, which is still, just the fact that they've woken up to the point where that can happen. But also speaking to that with womanhood, for example, and excuse me if this is clunky language, but there's a point in a girl's life when she bleeds for the first time where there's some innate sort of physiological built-in rite of passage. And obviously, depending on family and situation, it can still be very clunky and not really happen in a way that's appropriate. But at least there's a marker of some sort. Um, and for men, it's just, or for boys, there's nothing. And so, we get together in gangs as youths and we set fire to frogs and do all these things. And what we're looking for in all that sort of quote unquote bad behavior is just a rite of passage somehow. And generally without those elders around, and we're losing our elders big time, particularly in Western culture, or losing what they mean. And Stephen Jenkinson talks a lot about that if you've read some of his work. We need to kind of bring that back somehow. And me, as a 50-something-year-old guy, I think I can play somewhat of that role, but I'm still learning as well. So there's definitely that.
Yeah, that's a really good point that you touch on. That the girls transitioning into womanhood, they have this innate process that they go through, which is the first bleed, but men don't have that. So if we don't currently have this thread that is deeply stitched into our current culture and society, what avenues do men have to go down? What do you see is an appropriate path for men to take to step outside of these perhaps cultural or societal norms to go down into these initiations, into these rites of passage?
Yeah, I think it works in two ways, because we need to awaken younger men to the idea and that this actually needs to happen for them. That's one thing. But then on the other side of the coin, we actually have to have men that are available and willing and understand how to take these boys through that process. And so I see lots of men out there doing this work, and that's fantastic. But I think it needs to be broader, because there's not going to be access to these type of guys for most young boys unless they sort of stumble upon it or literally proactively go out there and look. So we need to teach older men how to become elders, and we need to teach younger boys to be looking for this, and the two to come together. Because at the moment, if I talk to an older guy about what it means to be an elder, they're not really giving me the answers that fill me with enormous amounts of confidence. It's like, well, I'm a granddad, and I speak to my grandchildren once a week, so I'm doing my thing. It's like, that's not it. They almost see it as a rite of old age.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm saying it actually takes work.
Yeah. And this is something, as you mentioned, that Stephen Jenkinson speaks to quite a lot as well. I've heard him talk about this kind of, you put it, a rite of old age. And I make a difference there between the elderly and the elderly.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. In this day and age, we're seeing a lot of men and women, and they're getting old and they're turning elderly, but they're not getting elderly. They're not carrying that wisdom to be able to hold the torch for the younger generations to come in a truly nutritious, nourishing way.
Yeah, and that's it circles all the way back to where we began about story. Like, they need to hold these stories and be able to hold a group of young men and say, let me tell you a story. And I can tell you specifically, I come from a Jewish background, and there's a Rabbi Leibowolf, who I used to see for a period of time each week, and that felt to me like sitting down with a true elder when I sat down with him. And this is the way it would work. I would sit down, and it would be sacred from the beginning, without any words spoken. And if anyone's even met Leibowolf, he looks like something directly out of Lord of the Rings. He's a beautiful, beautiful man. And I would start by basically vomiting what was going on in my life at the moment in a very sort of undignified way. Blah, blah, blah. And this happened, and she said this to me, and oh my God, and blah, 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 blah. And he would just look at me, and there would be this stillness. And even without saying anything, it would automatically bring me back to presence and bring me back to stillness. And he'd just look me in the eye, and he would just say, let me tell you a story. And then he'd talk about some thing which would seemingly have no relevance to the situation that I was currently facing in my life, talking about some ancient rabbi and in a village, and then it would spin all the way back around. And by the end, he nailed it. He'd completely nailed where I was, what I was doing, and what I needed to do. And to me, that was just a beautiful example of eldership, versus oldership, which I think is a beautiful way of putting it.
So I would love to get your take on something that we're talking about here, which is actively spending time with elders, or perhaps maybe not even actively spending time with elders, but just the notion of spending time with elders and then spending time in men's circles versus actually going through more of a structured process, in a sense, of what we might consider to be the rite of passage. And correct me if I'm wrong, but in the most basic way of languaging it, perhaps a rite of passage has 3 stages, and that could be deemed the separation, some kind of death process, and then a rebirth into something new. Is that how you might language it on a very basic level?
Yeah, absolutely. The separation, and then the grief and the sorrow and the despair, or whatever comes as a result of that. But then ultimately, um, finding the gifts within, under the earth, so to speak, and then the return or the rebirth being the part where you take that gift and you give it away in terms of being in service
And
for the greater good because of what you've learnt and what you've been through.
Yeah, and
So yes, I
in
agree.
an indigenous and a traditional context, a rite of passage context, typically there's some sort of immense challenge, almost dangers involved. And perhaps our rites of passage these days don't have the same sort of physical danger, but maybe there's still those similar levels of psychological or psycho-emotional dangers that we get ourselves into through, getting down into the depths that we were talking about. And I'm curious to know about some of your own rites of passage that you've been through.
Yeah, well, I mean, for me, and it's part of the reason why I came to this work, because I was thrust into the underworld without any tools and without any guides. I didn't really have good mentors in my life. I mean, I had my father, and again, this talks to the fact of your father not being the mentor or the person that's going to actually be your guide in the underworld. He plays a different role. And actually, just on that, before I get into my own experience, I was reminded of the way James Hillman, the psychologist James Hillman, talks about this. He says, your father, his role is to really protect you. That's the father's role, is to and to make sure that you're placed on a path that will be, I guess, secure. And so that's why you might often find your father saying, go and be a lawyer, go and be a doctor, rather than kind of understanding that you might have a calling which is very different to that. So he says, your father will never necessarily see you because he's not really looking. He just wants to place you on the right trajectory or the right path that he feels is safe and secure, and get married, have kids, and do all those things, usually. But he says the mentor is not interested in your safety and your security. That's why he'll take you through the rite of passage and you'll, to the point of death. But what he does do is see you, so that he will see your true calling. And he's like, you should, just not even shooting you, but just drawing that out of you. So in a sense, I love that distinction, this idea that the father will protect and do all those things, but the mentor will take you to the edge, but will actually see you.
Yeah, and before you get stuck into your own rites of passage, that is such a pertinent point for all men to understand, because this ties into how we have so many males stepping into alderhood instead of elderhood, because they're still carrying these wounds around their parents, and largely for men around not feeling seen by their fathers, but not fully understanding this key piece that you're speaking to, which is that it's not necessarily the father's role to be offering that to someone. It's someone outside of the father's role, someone on the edge. Yeah.
Oh man, it's beautiful, because I have so many men who come in, and one of the early, the father wound comes up pretty quickly in most conversations. And it's to accept that everyone's got a father wound of some sort. It's actually part of the rite of passage. But also they'll say something like, Dad just doesn't see me for who I really am, or he doesn't understand me. And my answer to that is always, what if he's not supposed to? What if he's not the one? Maybe you're barking up the wrong tree there, and that's something that actually doesn't need to be solved.
Yeah, a very, very potent gateway to enter and explore there. On a personal, reflective level. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. But I, in terms of my own experience, I guess it's what brought me into the work, because for me, I was pushed into that second layer or into the underground layer with zero tools. And it was deep for me in the sense that, you know, as you know, I lost my sister and my mum, which both took their own lives in quite a short space of time. And again, not too much time elapsed beyond that when I was diagnosed with a blood cancer. And so I had these three things, and, you know, three's the charm, right? Things always come in threes. And that ended up leading me to, I had to go into a psych ward for a little while. But interesting for me, if you think about it from kind of a rite of passage point of view, when I was sitting in that psych ward, it was a liminal space. It was beyond ordinary reality. You know, I was sitting in there, and you know, clearly I was outside of time and space. And so I was really able to start doing the work in there. You know, it was almost like a blank canvas. So I had to find my own way, and I did come close to death. I was suicidal in there. You know, and society was showing me that I was suicidal. You know, when you enter a psych ward, they take away your shoelaces and your belts, and suddenly you realize, oh, okay, I'm getting these messages that I'm feeling inside. Like, it's clearly evident to everyone. Plus, when you get, you know, on a rather humorous level, when you get registered into a psych ward and you've already had two members of your close family take their own lives, they take you pretty seriously.
Yeah, of course.
So yeah, so that was kind of my time under. But, you know, I stopped trying to fight my way out of that hole, and because I was in there. And so I had to learn how to be comfortable in that space. And to me, that's a critical piece of this. It's too many men, even when they do, or women, when they go into that descent, they come up too early, and they're not ready. And, you know, they come up for air, gasping for air. And you don't really come up until you don't need to. Does that make sense? There's this idea of the paradox of change being that you can't change until you accept where you are.
Absolutely.
And so for me, being in that underground space, you're there until you're okay being there, until you're not actually concerned when you come up. You know, in myth, for example, there's so many myths when the protagonist goes under the earth for some reason, and there'll be something like a musical instrument on the wall or some kind of reference to a way out, and he never takes it for a long time, and like thousands of years can go by in these myths, and he walks past the lute or whatever it is on the side of the cave wall, and he just doesn't do it. But when he eventually plays it, the access route to the above ground becomes evident again, and you start to think, well, why didn't he just pick it up 1,000 years ago? And it's like, well, because, you know, he knew he wasn't ready, even though it felt uncomfortable down there. You know, there's an old indigenous line, which I heard from one of the elders, and he was talking about this underground work, and he said, and this comes from Stephen Jenkinson, he said he was talking to some indigenous Australian Aboriginal elders, and he said, they whispered to him, "Don't tell anyone, but we kind of like it down there."
Sure.
And I
Yeah.
was like, oh, it's beautiful. It sat in me. It was like, oh, I feel that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, what you're speaking to, it reminds me of an important part of the hero's journey, which you touched on before, and it's that you got to wallow down there in the caves and in the darkness, because, as you said, if you come up for breath too early, then you're not bringing back the gifts that are waiting down there. And that's such an important part of the hero's journey. It's coming back to not just yourself, but coming back to family, friends, loved ones, the greater community, sharing those gifts with that wisdom.
Yeah, you've got to marinate. You've got to stew in it down there. You know, Robert Bly likes to say, you know, don't wipe the dirt from your face and let the tears dry to your face. You know, just sit still and don't rush it.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, thank you for sharing your one of the rites of passage that you went through, and openly sharing about your family, your mother and your sister. And that's a path that I'd love to weave into this a little bit, and it's on the topic of death and dying. And we both know how society and culture have developed this strange crust, this heavy blanket when it comes to openly discussing death and dying. And it's become an uncomfortable point of conversation for so many. But having gone through that process, with two loved ones in such a short span of time, it points to some of the offerings that you were giving around the meditations and the dialogues around death. And I would love to hear your take on the importance of incorporating meditations on dying and death into our lives. And I'd also love to hear your relationship to death and dying and how that relationship has evolved over time.
Yeah, I think that's probably the biggest piece of the learnings for me. I mean, in our culture, we talk about everything these days. It's like everything's on the table. You can talk about, you know, all sorts of different sexual activities or whatever you like, drugs and all these things. But when it comes to death, it's still kind of, hidden under the rug a little bit. And for me, she's the teacher hidden in plain sight. Every day, every moment, almost, we internally we're having a subconscious conversation with death. And you stop at the side of the road and you look left and you look right. It's really just a conversation with death. And when you begin to notice that, you start to realize that it can be so illuminating in terms of living a full life. How we engage with other people, and often we hear the example of something like road rage come up. It's like, if you were to actually think about what's actually going on there through the lens of death, you would probably treat that situation very, very differently. That this person in the other car has all this uncertainties, and death is coming for them and all their loved ones as well. Are you really going to behave in that way? You probably, if you started to think about that for too long, you'd probably want to get out of the car and give them a hug. And so there's a tiny little example of how it can be so informative. So for me, it's been very, very instructional. And living with cancer, for example, means that it's a bit more apparent to me. It's a bit more in my conscious, because every day is truly a gift for me, in my situation. But I don't think, I mean, I've had people, and this is, you'll laugh at this, people have come up to me and when I start talking to them about the cancer situation, when it comes up and I'm sharing something, they'll say, um, how does it feel to live when you only know you've got a certain number of days left to live? And I'm like, I don't know, you tell me.
We're all in the same boat.
I know. It's like, what difference? There's literally no difference between me and you. It's like, I don't even know if cancer is going to be the thing that kind of, gets me in the end. It could be anything. And I don't know if the person I'm talking to is going to live longer or shorter than me either. I mean, that's the gift, and that's the teacher that she is. All our lives are just basically on loan from death, and she can come and claim it back whenever she likes. And I think that's the beauty of her. And so when I do my death workshops, it's not about trying to put fear into people. It's quite the opposite. It's saying, it's a beautiful thing. And I've had the opportunity through plant medicine also, to be given some really beautiful insights into my relationship with my cancer, and to actually see it as a love affair. And when I sit, and because I do a lot of meditation, when I actually work directly with the disease through meditation, and when I say disease, I'm just using a modern term, so I don't see it that way at all. But and I see it as a love relationship. And so when I hear people saying battling cancer or battling this or battling that, I can't see it through those eyes at all. It's just a symbiotic relationship. And I often joke with my cancer in meditation. I say, you can't get rid of our body just yet, because then you're gone as well. So, we're both inhabiting this physical form right now. It would serve us both to keep it rolling. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I would love to hear you talk a little bit more about that if you're open to it. Your meditations, not just on death, but your meditations on and with cancer, that dialogue with cancer in a loving sense, because there's a lot of people with health issues, all kinds of health issues, whether it's psychological or whether it's actually physiological. There are a lot of people, and people have a tendency to ruminate on all of the fears and the anxieties and the stresses around their health problems, not recognizing that these are the very psychological processes that are going to make them more sick, rather than taking the approach which you seem to be taking, which is one of acceptance and love and working with it in a completely different way to transmute it in a sense. So I would love to hear your thoughts around that.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that springs to mind is, because I had a particular experience, a plant medicine experience, which was illuminating, and I could retell that story by way of example. But the way I meditate with it now is if I can if I can take it back to Michael Mead's kind of 3 levels of existence, like in that third level, there's also the deep, deep understanding, and it's more than an understanding. It's just it becomes part of you. This understanding that your body is a remarkable vehicle, and it's able to heal itself, and you just have to work with it and be committed to that, in a sense. And so for me, it's like, with that understanding, then there's ability for me to do some remarkable stuff in meditation. So my cancer is actually in my bone marrow. It's about an over proliferation of, in a sense, the blood that's formed in my bone marrow doesn't form correctly, and it forms too many of this and too little of that, and it does all weird things. But so for me is, if I can understand that process and almost visualize it. So, you might laugh, but what I did is I actually jumped on YouTube in the early days, and I actually looked at videos of these stem cells actually, what actually happens in the bone marrow. So I had a visual in my head. Does that
No,
make sense?
yeah, absolutely. And I think you're touching on some of the things that Bruce Lipton and Joe Dispenza speak of. If we can gain more of a visual image of what's happening inside our physiology, then we have a greater capacity to work with it in a beneficial way.
Yeah, and so it was actually reading The Biology of Belief from Bruce Lipton that gave me, this concept and this idea. And so now when I sit down and I close my eyes, I actually bring my attention to the marrow, which is around the pelvis and the hips and the femur bones in my thighs, and I actually visualize just like everything being okay, and everything kind of calm and still, and just working efficiently. And the difference is, I don't actually have to think about it, operating perfectly. I just have to think about it operating in a way which is workable in a sense, and not creating further damage. And still, see, it's, for me, it's like, the issues around these things is, if you beat the drums and you tell your body that something's wrong and it needs to be corrected, then that the body will listen to that, and it will start sort of adapting itself in a way which is going to be, really not beneficial to health. But for me, it's like, it doesn't have to operate in the way that, say, yours operates. Maybe it's like getting in my car and driving to work, and I have to go around some detours. But if I'm just quiet about that, and like, oh shit, there's roadworks and this is going to be bad, I'm going to be late to work. If I just go to work calmly, follow the detours, maybe I see some sights that I wouldn't have otherwise seen. It could be a beautiful experience. Arrive in perfect shape, then that's okay. And that's what I'm meditating on, rather than feeling the need to correct everything. It's just this idea that, it may be operating differently from my neighbor, but it's operating perfectly fine.
Yeah, the picture that's coming to mind is integrated or a more holistic sense of coherence between body and mind, and of course heart and soul as well. And it's a very
Absolutely.
It's a very shamanic way of working with the physiological processes and energetic processes that we all have. And I'm not sure if that's how you see it, but I guess this kind of leads us down a bit of a portal into shamanism. And I know you mentioned you're involved in the breath work and the Wim Hof breathing and the cold shock therapy, and you're also a HeartMath instructor as well. And we can go down a little bit of a rabbit hole perhaps later on about heart-based consciousness, but I'd love to touch on this idea of shamanic practices and shamanism, and I'd love to hear your take hear you articulate how shamanic practices and philosophies kind of inform your work and your life.
Yeah, it's interesting. So early days in this kind of, post being in the psych ward, I guess. One of the early things I got onto was actually Bruce Lipton and the biology of belief and that stuff. So it was kind of like almost, maybe not the exact starting point, but certainly early days. But it's interesting that you picked up on the fact that the shamanistic way of looking at health is quite similar, because also early on I picked up Michael Harner's book, The Way of the Shaman, and that's kind of where my entry point into that began, and I quickly realized that that Bruce Lipton's way and the road that I was traveling down was actually really similar to those very ancient shamanistic ways of looking at health, and so I was able to layer in. I got really deep into that for a while, but realized it was the same thread. And this is what I always say: it's like if I follow a thread and it leads to the same truth, then I sort of know I'm onto something. And if I go down a thread and it starts taking me away, then I sort of leave it. But when I see it come back and it's like there's that one truth again, I'm like, okay, then I integrate that into what I'm doing and how I'm showing up.
Yeah, so I guess this ties into exactly what I wanted to lead into, which is the heart-centered consciousness or heart-based consciousness. Because when we're entering these shamanic states of being, in one way or another, we're not only using the power of the cognitive capacities of the mind in all its various forms, but we're bringing awareness down into this space here, down into heart consciousness. And for a lot of people who have engaged in the work of shamanism or various plant medicines or other bodies of work that illuminate a similar signpost, some of the things that you're saying that lead down the similar direction, it becomes much clearer that there is a distinction to make between mind-based consciousness and heart-based consciousness. And this is something that you could speak to. I've read and heard from many sources that the heart's electromagnetic field has been measured, and it's significantly stronger than the field that the brain gives off. And a significant portion of the heart, from what I recall, are neural cells, which suggests that the heart is in fact another type of brain. And there's often talk of the three brains, the mind and the heart and the gut, and we could certainly speak to the importance of cultivating all of those to become more of an integrated human. But nevertheless, what science has revealed about the heart certainly points to something quite significant concerning the intelligence of the heart and heart consciousness. And being a HeartMath instructor, I'd love to hear the way that you articulate this, perhaps touching on the distinction between mind consciousness and heart consciousness, or the way that you see it or feel it. And also for those that have a hard time tapping into this, or perhaps those that are leaning on the side of skepticism, or heart-based consciousness even being a thing, how would you speak to that perspective? How would you language that?
The thing I like about HeartMath the most is that you can talk to people that are coming from all kinds of perspectives on this. Like, I can talk about the science and get you there that way, or we can talk about it from a spiritual point of view and get to the same outcome.
Okay.
And that's why I love working with people in a kind of HeartMath space or a HeartMath workshop, because I can come at it any different way and everyone will come at it. Again, it exactly talks to what I was saying before around those threads all coming out to the same one truth. So what you're saying there around the heart's electromagnetic field, et cetera, that's all completely accurate. And the reason that it has the most powerful electromagnetic field is simply because it does the most heavy lifting in terms of signaling. Because at the end, at the end of the day, we're all made of energy. We're all just, electrical signals, and the heart sends out the most signals to the rest of the body by a long way. So what's most interesting is that it sends far more signals. It's far more ascending signals from the heart to the brain than the brain to the heart. But if we wanted to take it back a step, the idea here is that our integration point for the way we meet our environment is the heart. Because if it has the strongest signal outwards, then the way we interact with our environment is just a sharing of energy, and it's going to be heart led. It has to be, because it's the strongest and the furthest out field. Does that make sense? So so wherever we go, we're just an exchange of energy with our environment, and primarily that exchange is happening via the heart. It has to. So um, um, you can talk about it through. That's why we talk about intuition as really being a heart science, because it's about that energetic exchange with another individual that's happening heart first. But because of the way we've been taught, which is we've all been forced up into our heads, like if I asked you how you perceived your environment, or asked a banker in the middle of Melbourne CBD, they'd point at their head. Yeah. Well, we know the truth is it's here. And if we asked our indigenous ancestors that question, they would always point to here. They just intuitively understood that. So for me, it's like this idea of, I mean, we can take it back to a very simple example. When I first met you, I felt connected to someone in a way that I generally wouldn't feel if I just met someone in a cafe. It was clear that we had a resonance between us, and you meet people in your life like that, and that's just an exchange of heart energy. It has to be. But we see it, what we imagine it as a thought form, because the first thing that noticeably tangibly happens is, oh, I like this person. But what we're not taking into account is that this whole mechanism, energetic mechanism, has actually happened before that point to make us have that thought form. And so that's what when we talk about heart-led consciousness, that's all we're talking about. It's just that we experience it as puny humans, as a thought being the first thing. But all this work has happened. And what's basically happened there is my heart energy has met your heart energy. They've resonated, and we know that two resonating fields will create something greater. So the signal that then sent back to my heart is an improved signal as to what it was prior to actually meeting you. And so my heart sends a frequency which is a feel good frequency. That frequency ascends on a signal up to my brain, and my brain, all it does is turn energetic signals into thoughts. And so that resonated signal, that improved signal, arrives in my brain, and my brain looks around into my environment and says, what could have caused that? And standing in front of me is you. And so my thought is, oh, I like him. And that's the first that we're aware of it. But if you step back, you realize that whole process began with heart-led consciousness.
Yeah, again, it's so interesting how the sciences are leading us down the same or similar pathways, just languaging them in different ways, but pointing to the same pathways that many Eastern philosophies or spiritual traditions or shamanism take us down as well. I mean, this is...
Yeah, it's beautiful.
As you know, you speak to, for example, the Amazonian shamans, Amazonian shamanism. You're the core foundation of where they got their knowledge and understanding of the plants from was through speaking to the plants, through communicating directly with the plants, through what Stephen Harrod Buhner would call the intelligence of the heart in the direct perception of nature. It's through using the heart's field to be able to tune into information and having that coherence and that resonance between self and another, and being able to pick up on those strands and those threads and feel. And then obviously that information then gets translated up into a cognitive level, rather than just being stuck in a cognitive level with no awareness of being able to come down here. And that's
100%.
Yeah, it's so interesting to see how both of these threads are weaving in the current situation that we find ourselves in as well. There's the conspiracy theories and the alternative narratives, and it's all fodder kind of for mind-based consciousness to latch onto, and we see it rampant in the digital space that so many of us are tuning into. And I feel like I know what one of your answers is going to be here, but for the people that are tuning in on only this level, only the mind-based level, and they're falling into the pits of fear or anxiety or stress or just confusion, what are some practical tips or techniques to be able to cultivate more of a sense of heart-based consciousness?
Yeah, I think it's just, it all begins with paying attention to what's happening in the center of your chest. It's like if you're out there and you are a practiced meditator, there's this idea of working with breath and doing all the typical kind of mindfulness techniques. But for me, add that extra step where you literally bring your attention down to the center of your chest. And the first thing to do is literally just observe. Just detach yourself from the thoughts. Oh, I'm feeling this, I'm feeling that. Just literally, the way I like to nuance it is to say, imagine you're a child that's just picked up a toy for the first time, and turn it over in your hands and be in awe and amazement. The child's not going, oh, it's green and I wish it was blue, or it's just literally going, whoa, what's this that I've never seen before? And I think bringing that sense of engagement with what's happening in your heart space back to this sense of awe and wonder is a place to start. No matter what you're feeling, doesn't matter if you want to label it good or bad or whatever, just be amazed that it's actually there. Is a beautiful place to start. And then from there, some people start to manifest it as a color or a shape. Get engaged with that, without judging or trying to evaluate it in any way. That's a great starting point. And from that point on, you can almost take a Bruce Lipton technique, is to think about what you and I have been speaking about, this idea that there are electrical signals that are being sent out. And actually, HeartMath would call it heart-centered breathing, which is literally on the in-breath, bringing all that energy back into almost like a pinprick of light. And on the out-breath, just sending it out way beyond your body and out into the ether, into the infinite, into the cosmos. Because remember, these waves, whilst HeartMath can measure them 25 feet away, they don't just stop at 25 feet. It's just in 2020, that's our fine-tuning scientific instruments can only measure it that far. But we know that these waves go on almost infinitely. They get affected by sound and lots of other things and very, very disrupted along the way, but we know that they're there. So essentially, if you go to the outer edges of the infinite, we're still there.
Yeah.
And so to me, it's like bringing the amazing wonderment of that actual fact into your meditation through heart-centered breathing. And then the next layer above that would be to start bringing in regenerating emotions like love and gratitude and appreciation, because that's when you start to work on the ascending signals between the heart and the brain, and you start to talk about coherence.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. What we're talking about and to, it's all fascinating, but there's two aspects of it. There seems to be learning about it, and then there's actually learning it. And the learning about it is almost useless in a sense if we're not putting it into practice. It's something that gains its power through that direct experiential understanding and knowing, again, tying into shamanism, the core of shamanism. And I've had many experiences of, whether we want to call it telepathy, but telepathy seems to be more associated with the psychological capacities, but it's like a telepathy of the heart, beaming out these energetic frequencies. And many times, whether it's been during plant medicine work or whether it's just been in daily life, actually consciously bringing the awareness down and almost extending, radiating out these frequencies and having people kind of turn around or engage with a smile or doing something. And it's that real first-hand experience to affirm what the science is now showing, but on that personal, subjective, experiential level. There is something tangible 100%. To it.
Yeah, and I like what you said about that example about putting it into practice. If that's the type of person that you are, if you almost sort of need a proof point, or then I would say next time you're in a shopping center, move into that heart-centered breathing. You can do it when you're walking along, and then fire love into the back of someone who's in front of you, and notice how often they'll turn around with this sort of quizzical expression. It's like something just hit me, and I don't quite know what that was. And there's lots and lots of experiments. I think the staring experiment's probably the one that comes to mind, which is very well publicized. That people seem to have a tendency to know not only that they're being stared at from behind, but even what direction it's come from. So, 9 times out of 10, not only will they turn to say someone's staring at me, and how could they know, but they'll turn in the right direction.
Yeah, and this certainly extends beyond the human-to-human interactions as well. If we are able to, open up and expand our awareness and our consciousness to to these, well, I label them as shamanic states of consciousness, because that's just the way that I orient myself within in daily life, in this kind of shamanic space. And I was just out for a walk in the wilderness, not yesterday, but the day before. And as I was walking, I had this sense to stop. And I just took a moment just to be still. And I turned around almost 180 degrees, and to the back there was a wallaby just looking up at exactly the same time. And we had this magical moment where we were not just looking at each other, but exchanging consciousness, this understanding that we're all individual filamental strands connected to the one source. And we all, while we do inhabit this physical manifestation where we are individual expressions of identity, and we can see individual expressions of identity in the other, but sometimes these filamental strands, these mycelial networks kind of strengthen, and we can tune in on a much deeper capacity, and these very, very interesting states of consciousness start to open up. So that's just speaking to the power of tuning in to these, the integration of all of these frequencies, of the mind, of the heart, of, the entire energetic field, and how we can just tap into so many different sources of energy around us.
Yeah, I love that example with animals, because you'll often find that there's just, if you catch an animal's eye, there's just a little moment there when you feel that. I think it's a real tangible opportunity when you're like, something happens, and this idea of being kind of, that level one human that we talk about, just for an instant just falls away.
Yeah, well, perhaps people will need to practice on animals more if we still find ourselves in this collective lockdown for some time.
Yeah. Maybe there's another workshop I can do at the fifth direction, and eye gazing with puppies or something.
Maybe. Well, how are you making sense of what we're experiencing on a collective and an individual level at the moment? And what's your take on the intersection of what it is that we're transitioning into and through, and how that kind of can weave into the potency of storytelling and mythology, that kind of bringing it back full circle to what we were talking about in the beginning?
Yeah, well, my mind started whizzing when you were asking that question, because there's so many directions I could take it. But I mean, it seems to me, evidently, this is a collective rite of passage. All these things we talked about in the beginning about a man or a woman going through their individual rite of passage in order to learn something, and having to go under and in the depths and find the gold and come back, and I think we're doing that as a collective right now. And I think a lot of the resistance that you're seeing is exactly the same resistance you see in individuals, that the refusal of the call, if you will, in the Joseph Campbell sense, to actually go under. But we as a collective, we actually need to go underground for a while. And this is this whole idea of isolation. It couldn't be more clear in terms of what that's symbolizing. It's we collectively need to withdraw and go under the earth, and actually feel the pain and the suffering of the earth and of ourselves, and learn the gifts, and then come back to the surface again. And my concern is exactly what we were saying before, around coming back and gasping for air and coming back too soon. This impetus that we're now seeing, particularly in the US, around reopening everything up, is this idea that we're coming up too soon, that maybe we haven't learned what we need to learn yet, and we're just gasping for air. And I feel that we probably need to stay under a little longer, and kind of learn. Not even that this is the bottom yet either. It's just, to me, the beginning of the descent, that the collective rite of passage. So, but I think what you're seeing here is this resistance to going under, and that's why alcohol sales have gone through the roof. That's why domestic violence has gone through the roof. It's why all these things are happening, is because of the resistance to the fall. Sitting and numbing yourself out watching Netflix is not how you descend.
Yeah.
So for me, there's a great opportunity here, and it could go one of two ways, as everything can, or one of many ways. And I guess we'll see what unfolds.
Yeah.
But in terms of the conspiracy theory stuff, I just wanted to mention that we've got to understand that that's the way that the human brain works. It's basically a pattern recognition machine, and when we can start to feel things coming together in a way which solidifies a certain story, then we're going to jump on it. And this is a very pregnant moment. In fact, I don't think there's ever been a more pregnant moment in our evolution for conspiracy theories to bubble up, because everything's going to feel like it's coming together into one giant conspiracy theory, and that's going to make sense, and it's going to solidify people's feelings. So I'm not saying to throw everything out either. I'm just saying hold everything lightly, and maybe understand a little bit about what your brain's trying to do in order to make sense of it all. Not that anything's right or wrong. It's just it requires critical thinking.
Yeah, I love that. And that's typically the stance that I try and align myself to, even though I get pulled in this direction and that. I'm always trying to come back and find some sense of solace in the not knowing. So being able to hold many different perspectives at once, but in the grand scheme of things, be like, okay, I know how the brain works. Ultimately, in the grand scheme of things, I don't know all that much. So just staying open to the many possibilities and seeing the bigger picture as well, which you alluded to. Feels like we've only just been dropped into the cauldron and things have only just started to bubble and brew, and we've got to simmer in there for quite a while for something new to emerge.
Yeah, and already we're freaking out, and we've just begun. So it's kind of it's an interesting moment in time for me. But I listening to what you said there, I was reminded of what Charles Eisenstein said. He was like, we're probably going to never really know the truth around coronavirus and all these other things. And he said, but if we do find it out, I guarantee it's going to not be what you thought it was.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a potent time for all of us individually and collectively to tap into that archetype of the alchemist as well. Yeah, the potential is there for us to turn lead into gold. And strong potential is.
I love that, and this is a Martin Shaw thing. So I know, listening to you talking about Martin Shaw, it feels to me like you've got a deep love affair with the man to the degree that I have, because I could sit and listen to him. I could sit at his feet and listen to him for many hours on end. I think that the way he uses language and just expresses himself is just utterly intoxicating. But he was saying something around this magician archetype too. And previously, I think we've been in kind of a shadow warrior archetype. The Vietnam War and all those things. It was kind of like we were fighting a lot, and not for true causes. And then it feels like we've kind of entered this era of the magician. And that's kind of where fake news comes from. It's this inappropriate use of words, and he feels that it's the shadow magician time, and I really agree with that. And in myth, the magician is often represented by the horse. And I was, the horse of power. You often see this, the man on the horse. These types of stories, and the horse is often the magician archetype. But he was telling a story recently. I don't know if you listened to a podcast with him recently with Ian McKenzie, but he was telling this beautiful myth around a man riding on a horse, and he gets presented with this opportunity. Well, basically, he comes to a fork in the road, and there's a wolf. There's a wizard or who says to him, if you turn left, you'll die. If you turn right, the horse will die. Yeah. And so he decides to turn right, and the horse is attacked by a wolf and is killed. And the man's very scared, but the wolf says to him, now you need to ride me. And then all these adventures unfold, and underground type stuff, a lot of suffering, a lot of grief. And Martin Shaw's point, and the point that I took out of it was, maybe we're moving from the horse to the wolf in terms of where we are right now, which is back to the warrior again, but maybe it's a more true form of the warrior. And so learning how to ride that wolf is maybe where we are right now in this time of isolation, feeling very scared about having to move from a horse to a wolf as a way of transportation. Does that land?
It's potent imagery to reflect upon. Yeah. I feel that stirring inside.
Yeah, for sure. Man, I just I listened to him tell that, and there was a place inside me that kind of got it even more than I cognitively got it.
Yeah, and that's often the case with many of these stories and myths that we come face to face with. Sometimes it's not just about us finding these stories and myths, but it's about them having their own life form and finding us at the right time too.
Yeah, and we often find in the circles that when we do tell a myth, that days later I'll hear from guys and they'll be like, "Oh, I get it now." Like 72 hours after letting it kind of work its magic within you, then a truth was revealed to you, rather than going, "Oh yeah," straight away.
Yeah, and I
Say the
like
same thing with plant medicine, right?
absolutely. Yeah, it ties into this same idea of, I think we were touching on it earlier, this kind of, whether it was before we started recording or after, this kind of rapidly consuming kind of culture that we find ourselves in. It's from one thing onto the next, onto the next. And that's why there's such potency in not just the plant medicines and the teachings and revealings and the wisdom that they have to offer, but the stories and the myths as well, really allowing them to sink into our bones, not rushing from one story into the next. It's really allowing them to claim us and to sit with them, and not just for the 72 hours, but to really develop this love affair that you're speaking of with these stories and myths. And it's through, I've noticed in myself, it's often over the course of months or perhaps even years that the stories, they take on new forms. And the more that we engage with them, the more life that we give them, and the more that they kind of evolve and weave in, like on a cellular energetic level within us. And yeah, just speaking to the importance of really allowing these things to sit with us and to bubble and to
Yeah.
brew and to change us on a deep level.
Yeah, I agree, and I'm immediately brought back to my own journey, and I think what landed me in the psych ward in the end was the fact that I never really had an opportunity to grieve my mother's death. I was automatically thrown into this facing my own morbidity, at Cabrini Hospital, being told that I had a cancer, and all of a sudden, uh, the previous happening, it didn't have time to sit in me and to understand what it meant to lose your mum and to grieve and to do all these things and to kind of grow. All of a sudden I was kind of having to deal with something which was more imminent, which was my own mortality. And so for me, I just don't think that, because I didn't get that opportunity, that I was able to cope. And so that's when I broke down.
Yeah, makes sense. Pieces of the puzzle align there.
Mm.
So I don't want to keep you too much longer, Asher, and it's a beautiful day out here in the country as well, and I wouldn't mind getting some sunshine myself. But before I asked a couple of rapid fire questions, in a sense, what I wanted to ask is that you're involved in a lot, and I'm curious to know what it is that's most alive for you right now. What is it that's singing out for the most attention in your own life?
In terms of the work I do, or on a personal level?
I would say yes to both.
Okay, yeah,
I would say
sure.
that they're inextricably intertwined, are they not?
They are, although my answer would probably be slightly different.
Okay.
Thinking at it from a lens of, because for me, in terms of being of service to the world, I think that the stuff around the men's work that I'm doing at the moment is calling me the loudest at the minute. And I think there's a real, particularly, I don't think we as men were in particularly good shape like prior to coronavirus, and I think that's just basically, this has been like a perfect storm for men in terms of getting into a really difficult place. And so for me, I think this calling out for all the stuff we were talking about in the beginning around understanding rites of passage and really providing a space for men to be seen and to be heard is calling me really, really loudly at the moment. So this stuff I'm doing around the warrior within and all that is kind of is really taking precedence over the other stuff that I do, I guess. That and this idea of getting more people into some form of meditation practice, through the work with Meditation Australia. Those would be my two big things at the moment. I would love to see a day when meditation is just an integral part of everyone's daily life. Like not I'm a meditator, so I'm something special. It'd be like saying I clean my teeth, so I'm something special, so
For sure.
so that is kind of another thing that's really potent in me at the moment. Personally, there's a deep calling for a book to come out, and I haven't really said that publicly, so maybe let that be the thing that comes out on record. But I can feel words and this willing, this wanting, this desire to kind of express and to actually have something tangible come out. I don't know if you felt that, but there's something inside me right now which is brewing. And I think it's going to take the physical shape of a book.
What's a passion of yours that you rarely share with the public, Asher?
If I shared it, maybe I wouldn't be so passionate about it.
Okay.
It comes back to the word again, brother. I am, if I have one obsession in life, it's poetry. And reading poetry for me is literally in and of itself enough reason to be alive in this body. I love it. I can't even begin to tell you. In fact, it comes back to Martin Shaw again, man. This is perhaps a beautiful place to end up, because he was actually talking about a man's connection to the divine feminine and to Mother Earth, and he was saying that the true connection is just so largely lost these days, and it should almost feel like a passionate love affair. And he was saying that a man should be able to read 5 stanzas of Pablo Neruda and feel a stirring in their loins. And he was like, if you can't feel that as a man, then, maybe you have some work to do in your connection to the divine feminine, that you should be able to open yourself up to that degree. And the fact that he used poetry as his vehicle in there just made me love him even more, because I feel exactly the same way. And so, when I read Rumi or Rilke or actually Neruda, I understand exactly what he means by that. So
yeah, that's beautiful, brother.
mm.
Well, to close things up, where would you like to direct people so that they can find out more about you and your offerings and your work, whether that's a website or social media?
Yeah, the website's just asherpackman.com. And Instagram is just Asher Packman. So I think, between those two things, you'll find me. There's the ability to catch up with what I'm doing, to contact me through those lenses, I guess. And that's really probably about it.
Yeah, fantastic. I'll have the links in the show notes to this episode as well, so they'll be able to find you there. So, brother, thanks for joining me. Lastly, just as we open up the space, I would love for you to share some words to formally close the container that we've co-created, but I want to put a little bit of a twist on it. So, in closing, if you were to deliver your last, say, 30-second speech to your loved ones, to nature, to the ancient ones, to the old gods, to Great Spirit and the Great Mystery, what would those last 30 seconds sound like?
As far as a question without notice, man, that is a doozy. That is a doozy. I feel like I'd have to do it with a little bit of humor, I think. And there's a wonderful, I'm going to close this normally, but there's a wonderful quote by Kurt Vonnegut. Have you ever got into Kurt Vonnegut?
I have not.
He says, and I'm going to butcher this a little bit, but I'll close proceedings properly. But I would probably, the sentiment of this is around the last 30 seconds is absolutely where my mind goes. And he says something like, I was just a little bit of mud that had the opportunity to sit up and look around, and I'm so grateful.
It's profound. It's poetic.
Mm. So it will be in that theme for sure.
Yeah, beautiful, brother.
Mm. So would you like me to close off?
If you've got a few words that you'd love to share, please do.
Yeah. Simply just closing down our eyes and coming back to the breath again. And let's just bring our attention to the center of our chest. And as you do so, for those that are listening, for the two of us, just to allow all these words, all this information to just descend with it from the mind and land in the heart, the center of the chest. And just let it settle there. almost like seeds in a garden that you're planting. And let's just add a little water, add a little nourishment to this garden to allow these seeds to sprout. And in this way, we're turning this information, these words, we're beginning to turn it from knowledge into wisdom. And we allow this to sit in our hearts and to grow with love and care. And we extend our attention to the four sacred directions, north, south, east, and west. We thank them for their presence in this conversation, for their guidance, for their wisdom. And whilst we retain them inside us, we release them. Aho.
Oh, brother. Thanks for joining me on Birdsong today.
Thank you so much, brother. It's an absolute pleasure to be here.